Hi,
Can
Gwenessa.
you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay. So I think
Cool.
we'll wait a little bit. Yeah, how are you doing? Maybe
I'm good.
yeah, cuz so where are you, I guess for people who cuz both of us have been moving around. Like so where are you right now? You're home. You're in
I
Buffalo.
am in Buffalo. Yeah, Buffalo, New York. Not far from Canada, just a river away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like this. Like we were saying our little a reunion of sorts. And so I don't know if it's
Yeah.
echoey, so just let me know how this sounded. So I managed to So I'm in the gallery right now at Republic Gallery, and yeah, and so for friends who, I've been out of touch for a while, so we're on unceded territories of the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So, and it's great because we've known each other originally here, um, and then I don't know when that was, and then but we've also crossed paths in New York and have somewhat of a connection when I was in Alberta, and now so we're away and apart. Um, yeah, so thinking of, in terms of finding someone to have this conversation with, it was very much an excuse to try to catch up and bring our communities together through this time. So
Yeah, happy
trying
to
to think.
see people we know from Vancouver joining in.
Like
Hi,
popping up.
people.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I'm trying to
it's
figure
fun.
out, yeah, like everyone's little handle identifier. Um and so you're and I've known you with several veins, and so right now you're curator, right, at the University of in Buffalo. For you've been there for a while,
Yeah, Buffalo.
for
Yeah.
a couple of years.
Well, I've been here for 1 full year. Yeah, I got
Okay.
here last September. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
So let's see, how are we? 12:05. Should we
Yeah.
try to, yeah, trying to making sure people, it's like always like a little bit of a hi, allowing people to roll in. And so let me know too. I think we tested the Wi-Fi. It's been a week of tech issues. So also just let me know if people out there can let us know if it's not quite working. Um, yeah. So, but so I guess for people who are joining us and who haven't seen us in a while, I think our talk is on the occasion of many things, but really excited to invite Liz to chat about a recent body of work I had made which is on in this room at Republic Gallery, titled Figure Unknown. And I think it just opened, well, it's been a while, but it opened in September, around mid-September, and so it'll be going on till towards the mid or end of November. And in thinking about who I wanted to, we always have these artist talks, but I felt it would be appropriate to invite you because one, because of the history we share, but also your interest in research in terms of representation, photography, but also intersections with history and also contemporary and current politics right now in terms of representation. So those were some things I think we've been discussing on and off in our conversations throughout the years. Um, yeah, so I forgot we did talk earlier. The great thing about this is both I think our first Instagram sort of live interaction as sort of co-host is having a chance to talk, but it's a different situation where I've shown you the work virtually, but it's interesting to have this conversation more theoretically where you haven't seen the work physically. But should I give you a tour? Should we
Yeah, maybe like a quick scan with your
scan?
yeah,
Okay. So
just
I
so you
have
don't lose Wi-Fi in the
I
gallery.
know, right? It's like you move and then oops. Yeah, and I'm also known to drop things too. So I have great company with me. So I think Maggie Day, who and we're 6 feet apart, might just pivot because and we're going to try to move this around. So the work, there's components. You can still hear me? 3 components. So there's a series of photographs. So the show, for me, is exciting to talk to you about because it's a new way of thinking for me where the whole body of work looks at one particular object called the Ruby Creek stone figure. By accident doing research, looking at archives at the Royal BC Museum, in Victoria. And so there's this stone bowl that's also a figure. So in itself, it's quite a dramatic thing to look at, and it's about this size. But the whole the exhibition and the work looks at they're all representations of the figure, artifact bowl / figure. And so on this wall, you see the photograph. So I'll let sort of Maggie sort of scan it. It's sort of hard because I think. I don't know if you can see that. Scan, and then that's good, like a pivot. And then on the other wall are also these are drawings of the figure with colored pencil on paper Duralar, and they're on the opposing wall of the photos. And then the final component, this is a bit tricky, is painting, which I can unpack the content with you. This is the one, so it appears as a blank canvas, but when you enter, you're given a UV light, and there is another artifact that appears on the canvas when it's lit. So those are the 3 sort of anchors for this sort of new body of work for me. And sorry, we're just like hard with this awkward maneuvering, but thank you. And so those are sort of the entry points for me to think about the work, and to unpack it a little bit for our friends who haven't seen the work. The way you enter in, you see the photographs and eventually the drawings, but they're created in a way where there's a dialogue in the creative process as well. So this figure, which I had drawn, artifact, I had drawn in a series of steps. So at first I was looking at the artifact. It created these actually, I think you can see it. This blue, sorry, it's like a shaky Blair Witch Project situation. The artifact with the blue colored pencil, and after the drawings are created, they are scanned, digitized to create the photographs. But an important part of the work, which the viewer experiences, that so the sort of orangey glow of the photographs is a product of the inversion, a review of color theory, where the blue becomes an orange. And so when I was drawing the original in the drawings, in a sense, they're these negatives. I imagine themselves as almost these analog draw negatives that are then used to create the actual photographs themselves. So what I was curious to know is unpacking the photograph in a way as does that become like the true representation of the artifact, because the way the negative and the positive works, it's only through the photograph that you actually see the object in terms of its true lightness and value, if that makes sense. So that sort of lays the groundwork, I think, for sort of the context of the conversation we're going to launch in, but I think I'm excited to sort of just meander through the possibilities of what the object suggests and propositions in relationship to representation as notions of history and how it's embodied in the figure object. Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
that was a
It's
lot.
also good to I saw I saw
Mm,
the photo documentation and even like the video documentation, but it's actually seeing you in the space.
mm,
I didn't realize the scale of it, and I think that's always like a thing that is really hard to tell through a screen. And when you were sort of doing this with your hands to show like how big the original object was, like I didn't realize like how much bigger the photographs would be or are actually. So yeah, it's
yeah,
good to see it in
that's
relation to your book
absolutely something that we're
creator,
in this
the negatives.
context. Yeah, yeah. So, um, but yeah, I think in creating the work, one thing we were talking about I was really interested in is because you've also been doing a lot in terms of the dialogue of representation and photography, both in a museum context as well as the image. So, like to me, this idea of the legibility of the image, like whether or not it becomes
Yeah.
different or somehow the veracity of the image when it's in the form of the photo. So you're in this room seeing the drawings on the photos. Um, Whether the experience is different through a different medium, but also whether the I don't know if veracity is the right word, but even as I'm looking at the photographs now, the hold that the photograph has as the medium through which I think we still register as something that is, in our space that somehow becomes more common is the photograph opposed to the drawing. There are different experiences which I'm trying to grapple with through the repetition and the recreation of the works through these different forms. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like right now we don't really have a choice under COVID but to
Yeah,
experience the work through photography.
yeah, that's
And
true.
like right now, well, this conversation is happening in offline through the help of photographs, essentially. But the fact
Hmm.
that you are the one who created the negatives, so no matter how indexical the actual photographs are that you present in the gallery space, you're the one who like hand drew the negatives. And however faithful you may have been, you're creating it's a object of your own construction.
Hmm.
And I find that when we were
No,
having
that's
this
true, and it's sort of.
converse, yeah,
Oops, sorry. I think
when
Liz,
we
you're
were
break.
having,
Can you hear?
oh, yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
When we were earlier having this conversation in preparation for this, I sort of teased you a little bit because the title of your project is Figure Unknown, and I said, "Well, but you've never like actually made any figural works." So this is
Right.
in some ways like
Yeah.
first
No.
admittedly figural work.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was also like a lot of things. I think were. It's interesting talking about this work now. Like I think. Well, I think a lot of conversations have a different lens. The now being our circumstances with and so to think about bodies for me right now means something different. I started this before, everything was starting to unfold in terms of the lockdown and the bodies we're in, depending what part of the world we're in. And but thinking about it, I think the thing that was enigmatic to me was that conundrum of it was a nice transition to look at I was looking at previously looking at artifacts and objects, and so and always thinking of them as vessels in some ways. So there's always like the body as an extension. I think this is the first one in a while. I don't think I've actually painted or represented a figure per se since 2004. So, so you know, it's great that you know, again, because we have a relationship, and then seeing these differences over time, that the art was complicated for me, and that it's both a vessel and a figure, and so that I think, but also thinking about the figure, like going back to like what it means now, I think of also being more interested in the body because we are very much deprived of a physicality because of COVID.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that was that wasn't a planned intersection, but as the work was being made, I think about those a lot more. And so that I think influenced the way in which, because this drawing, the one I just showed you here, it's interesting because my mark making, the body becomes in that piece, because that was the piece I had really worked on when everything just started like falling apart for me in April, where I was, and when you know we started to be like fixed in place. So it actually, in a way, as you're saying, it is indexed in the work, like my body on body in thinking of it. Yeah.
Well, I also feel like your other works, kind of insinuate a body, but it's never quite made its way into the figural representation. Because, you know, for instance, like previous work where you have drawn the shadow of a chair, of course the chair is for the body, but the body's not there. And or a painting of a window, like it's the body that is in front of the window looking out. But you know, there's always sort of it's almost the implied position of the viewer, and that way you're thinking about you're redirecting your people's attention to their own body, right? And when you, again, like I go back to like you sort of doing this to show how big it's like trying to understand the object through your body.
Sorry, I think I just missed that because I think we're cutting out a little bit. The scale?
Like the scale of it, yeah. Because when we are talking about scale, we're trying to understand something through our own body. Our body is the measure, right? It's the measure of distance, it's the measure of size and weight. So there's knowledge that is received and learned through the body itself. So it's also an interesting kind of juxtaposition of the word figure and unknown in your project. Like, why is it unknown, right? And we discussed this a little bit when we were talking about your project earlier.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Liz.
Oh, no. I'm curious too.
Having a little bit of a glitch.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
I was just curious. Can you hear me?
You just froze. So I missed that last part. I think I just heard about, you were asking about the figure unknown. I don't know if you can repeat that last bit.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the juxtaposition of the words known.
Oh, no.
Because you're trying to,
okay.
Yeah, you're trying to like learn about the figure, right? Like you're trying to like figure it out. And then
right.
You have added the word unknown to it, right? Yeah. So, what about it is unknown to you?
Well, so that set me on a path in terms of figuring out, like, So I have to thank Grant Keddy, who is, I believe, the curator in the archaeology area within the Royal BC Museum. And in speaking with him, it's interesting in terms of within his collection. Um, I sort of went into that question, like of what is unknown, and I think it for me comes from the way in which I think museums, but in different fields, museums and in this case archaeology, how knowledge is established, like through the learning of an artifact. So in this particular case, the provenance is not known. So there's like descriptions of what it possibly could be made of, but they don't know. You're right. I missed the obvious thing. So this figure is around possibly 2,000 years old, but they don't know where it came from. And so that was intriguing to me, like that tension between like a specificity of what is known. So they have like three hypotheses. It could be like, and this isn't even based on what it looks like, which is fascinating, just by the way the markings on the back in particular, and the material be like made anywhere between like I think the 1700s and the 1900s, based on like how they think it was made with a metal file and a chisel. Or it could have been potentially made by indigenous communities, or it could have been, and that would have been really, really early, probably, again, 2,000 years plus. Or third hypothesis is it was somehow arrived here from overseas, like through trade or through the path across the ocean, and it's fascinating to me, like as a layperson, of this is really interesting, but it doesn't have enough, I guess, weight for pursued, and the tension too of like what is known, like it's here, like this thing is in in our in the museum, like, well, it's in the sort of in the collection, but it's not on display. So, and that's another really interesting I wanted to talk to you about. So there are things that are known, but because it cannot be pinned down, it lives in that arena of what is unknown. Turning back to your question, and the conundrum I'm really interested in is that both that specificity but also vagueness. And until it's proven, I love the fact that this could be all those three things at the same time. So it's also by extension, like when something is not known, it allows for possibility in terms of like a speculation, not only of history, but like possible another possible future or narrative. If it by really like an indigenous carver, that would be fascinating, or if it was some from afar. Yeah, so I think that sort of circles back to like earlier conversations we had. One thing I want to visit. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were also, for me, like when you have the word unknown, to me it sounds like an old museum convention or art historical convention where you say unknown artist, but there's an increasing sort of desire to update these conventions. So more and more institutions are using the word unidentified as opposed to unknown, because while it might be unknown to a particular curator, a particular institution, but it might be known in the communities in which it originated. Definitely the people who made it would have known about it 2,000 years ago. Yeah, the word unknown kind of signifies for me the subjectivity of the knowledge maker and the institution of knowledge, right? to say that this is sort of
Right.
charts
So you cut out there.
yeah.
No, yeah, and the complication of that too, which like I really appreciate you pointing that out too, of like who is it unknown to, which is problematic because you're right in the sense of I may not know, the archaeologist may not know, but you know, in terms of the original creator or the community and to which it belongs, that is known, right? In terms of that history in which it comes from. So I think that's true in terms of pointing to that nuance and the shift where it begins to enter in that conversation of how things are named. And so, and for me, I think thinking about my relationship to coming to something that, I mean, I like that, I think having that shift to think about in terms of an unidentified object, then it shifts. I mean, it also begins to think about the question of like objectivity and subjectivity too, like within the naming of things, either in a museum context or, you know, in the academic setting when I was trying to research these things. So I think it definitely points to the importance of thinking about, you know, that subjectivity of who does what is um, and I think that was
Yeah.
yeah.
I also think about the word identification and what that implies. So if something is being identified, there has to be a purpose, right? Like, what are you trying to identify this object for? And, you know, that kind of calls into question the raison d'etre of the noms, right? Like why must it be identified? Why must it be preserved? And can it remain unidentified? And you know, these are questions that sort of aim at the heart of the museum and like what kind of institution want to be and could be in the future.
Right. Sorry, I just missed that. So what, in terms of the museum of what we, the idea of an object that can exist, particularly within an institution, but in that state of being unidentified.
Right.
And I think that, yeah, and I think sort of this object, you know, as a case study or extension of that is sort of, I think we're talking about in terms of then it doesn't enter into like the display case because it cannot be identified. And I'm wondering if that's sort of a direction in which sort of museums or in which we try to understand history, can we have a dialogue and talk about enter into in this case like historical objects and sit with them being unidentified and have that a reality, if that makes sense, or what?
Yeah,
I don't know if
totally.
that's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to actually acknowledge, I think, is so important, and something that a lot of individuals and organizations are actually
Oh,
doing.
no.
To, I'm here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think
So
you're
I don't
cutting
know if
out,
you
Liz.
heard me.
No,
Oh,
can you
okay.
repeat that last part?
Okay. So I was saying that to acknowledge the limit knowledge is something that a lot of individuals and organizers are fearful of doing. But I think it's remarkably important for us to kind of say out loud, like these are the limits of what we know and what we have, and as a way to kind of provide a foundation for moving forward in terms of what what of the past we must contend with, because it's not for me, like it's not the desire to know everything and to collect everything is something that is being increasingly contested with. So why not tackle head on the very limits of our knowledge? And I think there's so much potential, and I think that's kind of the driving force of your project, right? To think about the unknowns and the, how we know, because that ultimately brings to question the agency and the power in knowledge making.
Right. Sorry, it was like a bit of a what's the equivalent of like the spinning wheel on Instagram? Sorry, I just lost you there. But the right, like sitting with that space of and knowing. I think we were also talking about how it is also difficult. Not, and I can, and both of us have worked in situations, right, where how the unknown, or I should say that I like the idea of that the unidentified as the space of possibility, but also, and so what you're, I think, what you're recognizing is moving away or steering away from the fear of not being able to identify something and not being able to acknowledge the inability to articulate, in this case, particular histories or the source or the provenance of an artifact or a narrative, and how, thinking about now how within museums or as artists or anyone sort of engaging with these conversations of how being I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but open to entertaining the identified, because it places you in a position of, in a way, like if you position it in a space of learning, it becomes more generative. But I think often within a museum context or the ideas of fear, it's seen as like surrendering and authority in some ways, which I think increasingly we need to do, and we're trying to do within the institutions we work in.
I think another fact about project and the issue of talking about objects in museums is that they kind of, like in your work, Gwenessa, the object, they imply humans, right? They imply humans, the human creators, humans who actually took the objects from whatever site, context to the museum, and the humans who categorize, take care of, and display the objects in some certain cases. So it's this, when we're talking about the figure unknown, or the objects that are in the collection, we're actually talking about a whole system that implicates all these individuals. And when we talk about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, it becomes a scary proposition, because we have to we enforce so many things through and boundaries through what we know and what we don't know. And that's not, I don't think that's necessarily an inherently bad or good thing. I think, there are instances where we have to sort of mark the boundaries of what we know and what we don't know. And, a theorist that we often have talked about in the lead up to this conversation is Edward Glissant and his idea of opacity, the right to demand opacity as the real foundation of relation, where we have to acknowledge that, okay, there are things that I won't know, I don't know, but that will not be a determining factor in how I hierarchize my relationship to you, right? So I think of that when when we're having this discussion of what is known or unknown.
I mean, and that like ties in beautifully too, because the that position. And I've been thinking about opacity a lot too, of in a way that becomes a wonderful space to think about in living with the identified and the unknown. But then I started think after we were talking earlier, made me think about the actual process of if they were if there are in this context with the object, if they really want to pin down the provenance and the date, then the knowledge requires damage to the object. Like in order to date the artifact, you actually have to break a part of it to submit to a test. And so then the the researcher, the academic, or whoever must make a decision, right, of whether or not to damage it. But in a way, it to me that is tying it back to Glissant, and then one must live in that space, like surrender that, like for the purpose of preserving the object, you actually have to leave it unknown. And so when I learned that, like I was, that dilemma, perhaps is like more of the direction to think about, to live in with the relationship to what Glissant is saying is this, here you are in this like real, like situation of, no, let us not damage it for the sake of knowing, and to let it be as it is. Yeah.
Right. And that's such an interesting dilemma, because there's the physical care of the object, but then there's also the intellectual care of the object, right? So like it's a case where the physical well-being of the object kind of takes a priority over the desire to know more about it. And the fact, just because an object is well taken care of physically, it doesn't really translate to its ultimate, I guess, importance or function in the context of a museum. Because if something sits there with limited sort of locked in knowledge that could potentially be really important for whatever reason it might be, like it's a trade that you've made to preserve the physical object. And I feel like that happens a lot in all sorts of cases, archaeological, but also art, in the name of the integrity of the object.
I mean, it also, it touches on the idea of function too, in terms of the life of an object. Because I'm thinking about when we were talking earlier of ways in which the museum space and institutions and areas of archaeology, how does one, as you're saying, like care for not only the physical artifact, but the knowledge and dialogue around that. So like the flip side of then museums now, like particularly with indigenous significant objects, where the only person who can handle it is someone who has that, who is a knowledge keeper, right? So not anyone can touch it. So that I think you're pointing to the question of also what is care, or how does one sustain or actually allow an object to exist as it is intended, despite the idea, like because it's just like when you touch a thing, the idea of like damage, but then when it isn't touched, when it isn't activated, then it loses its purpose,
right?
In some way, yeah.
And I guess turning the spotlight back to you, Gwenessa, like what you have done, what you have done with the object is you have fragmented it visually. You have turned it this way and that, and you have in order to try and recreate the whole, you have literally created visual fragments of the object, and you have also inverted it and created various photographs. So like for me, that in itself is like the dilemma, like this attenuated space between the observation and the creation of the image as a whole. And I find that actually very, like, I was very relevant to your practice overall because right before this meeting, I remember that I had written a couple of things on your work. So I revisited them. And this was from like, I don't know, I think 6 years ago. And I remember that I was thinking about your painting, one of the earliest paintings, which is windows, paintings of windows. And I talked about them as like, as cameras, like you're in a camera, you're in a darkened room, and the window is the aperture, and you're in this space where you're thinking through what it is that you are viewing through this aperture. And I feel like this separation between the image making, the making of the negatives in parts, and the photographic prints that you ended up with, you're literally putting the viewer right in the middle in the process of making the, and
Right.
yeah. And I was just thinking about that, even as you were giving us a tour, like you want the viewer to be the one in like really in this unfixed state of image making.
Right. No, I think to experience, because that was the one thing I think we were talking about of this being both a continuity, but also an experiment for me to think about the limits of perception, but also having the viewer experience, I think, the grappling and the struggle I'm having with understanding this object through those ideas of looking and I think perception, which you had articulating. And part of it, I think, is the idea of the cuts and the splicing and the cropping of the figure. You're right. Yeah, that link to earlier work where I had been in a way cropping these spaces or isolating spaces in some way to call into question like our physical bodies and looking at them. But I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. There's a voice, some ambient like vehicle truck passing by. I think the one thing I was also thinking about, because it is placing the viewer in it, but in this case, as you were saying, it's now a stand-in also for a body, which was slightly different. And for me, I think the act of cutting it was also playing off like a simple device of perception, but almost the psychological test where, because I went in knowing what this object was, this project was also a question for me of whether I could undo what I know, right? And so the act of creating the work is a visual, in a way, extrapolation of it's, all the images together would allow a viewer to see it. But it was a question for me of would they see what I originally had seen, and so in making them, it was something I was also trying to do. Like, can I undo like what I know? And that sort of goes back to, I think, what you're saying with glissant and opacity, and also thinking about the viewer's experience of how do I bridge and like inhabit that, return back to the space of a viewer who doesn't know, or that space of identification, the call into question. When we do know something, can we unknow it? Can we call into question, especially when it comes to false histories or things where we need to rewrite or redo things? So I think the visual cuts that you're identifying too became one of, thinking about the viewer, and also bringing back to what you're saying, how it becomes even more important because it's a relationship to a cut body as well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of actually making photographs out of, your drawing, which is not quote unquote reality. It's not, even the photograph is an indexical sign of the negative. Is an indexical sign because of the way the light is captured. It's not like you have created like fake images, quote unquote, fake images.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep thinking about that because you're wanting to know so much about this object, which probably is very unimportant in the grand scheme of things, right? In the
Yes.
museum, it's like this object that probably people didn't care enough to actually get to the bottom of.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're creating this sort of elaborate visual project in order to try and grasp something. And I find it really sort of both puzzling as a viewer and really fascinating that this unimportant object is sort of like what you have taken on as a way to kind of question the looking process itself, the documentation process, and the conventions of museological care on an object. So like the object itself is like almost a foil. Like that in itself isn't necessarily important. It's everything that you have done to it and around it that is what matters the more in the context of this project of yours.
Right. Yeah. It's almost, and I mean, and it's interesting coming again as like not an expert in this field, how one chooses like what is important. And you're right. It is not not exactly like a groundbreaking find in that sense. But in a way, it became a because I feel like yeah, if it were a really pointed object, I mean, it has then it is about the object. So it is both like, and again, this is a space of contradiction, which I'm really interested in. Is it's both about the object, but not. That it's the process of doing it and almost needing the object. So its significance is it the process needs a vehicle in some ways, and so the object becomes a necessity for that reason, but not like at its expense in some way. But but it also calls into question, I think, as artists, like what we call attention to, like it isn't important to, in terms of perhaps like the grand scheme of things in terms of groundbreaking scholarly knowledge. But yeah, in terms of the arbitrariness of how, like for me, it then wonder like why, because
Right.
it doesn't, yeah, it doesn't prove anything per se, but yeah.
But that's also interesting because oftentimes it's these weird outliers that don't necessarily fit in with established streams of history that end up being these unimportant objects in the museum, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't belong in the narrative of history in the context of the museum. So it ends up sort of reinforcing its unimportance and more or less like intellectual neglect, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
And then,
I want, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
oh no, yeah, and then the flip side is like, then what would it take? What would it take for this to then become, to take our priority in some ways? But I'm not sure. Yeah. But you were going to say something. Sorry.
Well, I also wanted to hear from you a little bit about how this object is one of a bunch of objects that you have already sort of examined in a past body of work, right? Where you had this very compelling title of articulate object, which to me is the diametric opposition to figure unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So you have very verbose objects that say a lot, and then you have this figure unknown. Yet you chose to kind of bridge those two objects with the same figure from the museum. So maybe you can address that a little bit.
Right. So I find increasingly when I'm creating work, there's always like a piece or a work that becomes like a like a hinge or a turning point for another body of work. So it's basically one long conversation, but which in a way it's apt that you talk about in terms of it becomes verbose and then it becomes silent in some ways. So this one figure actually was the last drawing I had done, drawing and photograph. So I've been doing these pairings of working in this process of like drawing and then the photograph inversion of the drawing. So that originated with the other body of work called the articulate object, where I was looking at actually the opposite of revisiting the question of how does one know or how does one identify. And there were 3 case studies I was looking at, and this was one of them. But what set this apart was it could not be identified, whereas the other 2 case studies in that body of work were like one was identified and one was almost like they think it was, but it's still not quite. But there was more documentation. There was more of a conversation of what they speculate, those 2 other objects were. And so the idea of the articulate object, like that's interesting because, yeah, you've caught me. This one was both like an articulate and then this case then becomes somewhat inarticulate, where I was thinking about how the object can speak, right? And so it goes back to that question of who knows what, and in that case, I was really interested in the conundrum and the really interesting complexity of those three case studies, and the other 2, which were more verbose in the sense of going back and forth of this object, it could be this, and that. But through that, like the question of whose narrative comes through, and despite what was written about it, the feeling I had in reading those case studies was that in the search for the provenance or the true identification of what these things are, is in a way allowing the object to speak for itself. And it sort of was stemming off of, and it began in a different context of when I was looking at I.O. Wiseman's research with forensic architecture, and he had been looking at the idea of very different, like in terms of not so much the object, the historical object, but the object in a way images in the space of civil conflict when there is no witness. And so the idea of the artifact, and in the writing I was looking at bones, like as a type of artifact, and how they become the witness for an atrocity or an event, right? And that became like an early seed to think about how objects, moving from that space of the forensic space to the museum space, which is context, but the significance of objects in that case still call into question, like who is doing the speaking, like who speaks for these, and can they have a life of their own? And I think that is something that we're all trying to grapple with and shift the attention back to the object itself rather than us speak for it, but to allow the object to speak. And so this, in a way, is my reaction of like, I can't speak for it. And so in a way, it's in a way another position to think about. And I'm realizing I think our just to let our viewers know we might be cut off because of I think we have a couple minutes before, like 4 minutes or so before there's a dispersal. So if we get unplugged, we can restart again. But
I want to, that's actually I just want to say that's a beautiful way of talking about your project, because that way of admitting to your shortcomings of being able to speak on behalf of something. I think that really is something that we were talking about all this time in terms of opacity, in terms of the unknown object, and you're kind of sharing that space with the viewer by presenting a work that is very much about the instability of knowledge. I find that incredibly.
Mhm. Sorry, talking about stability, and I think I lost I lost you there for our stability is translating into like Wi-Fi. It's picking up those reverberations of instability as well. No, and I think increasingly that's another like way of entering into it too. Like we've been talking about like the unidentified, and now like the unstable. Um, and also, again, I can't help think about the context we're in, where increasingly I'm hearing of a lot of people thinking about works or creating works that are coming to reckoning with like a destabilization of, like where we are in terms of knowledge, um, uh, in ways in which um, so I don't know if there's a countdown or not, but no, I feel like that becomes I think you've pointed out to something I didn't really, it didn't become apparent until we're having this conversation. I don't know if we want to have questions or
Oh yeah, how does that work?
uh no, I don't know how this is going, because I've never done an Instagram session where and more of like in a Zoom session, like people type things, but that might be a little bit difficult, but we can try. I don't know if people have questions, and again, if there's enough interest and we get disconnected, we could like reconnect. But in a way, if it's okay if we end on a space of destabilization.
Yeah,
Yeah.
destabilizing the knowledge, because we have to
Oh,
foundation of knowledge, right?
yeah. I mean, one thing, I don't know if we do get disconnected, one thing I did want to maybe we could talk about, or perhaps another time, is questions of history in relationship to the of time, like the past and the idea of history also being, or a destabilization of time itself. Oh, shoot. Okay, now I got the countdown, 25 seconds. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so I don't know if you want to
Right.
wrap up, or should we try to entertain that question of the history, also we need to think about like the present and the future. Um, and like that's also another form of destabilization. Shoot, 5 seconds left. Oh,
Yeah.
shoot, maybe we should, because there's a question. So I thought, yeah, but I mean, again, I just wanted to take the opportunity. I mean, there was so much. Um, yeah, we don't have to drag it out, but people have to have their day. But yeah, that was one thing I wanted to maybe end off with you. Maybe for like a couple more minutes was sort of returning back to this idea of that space of speculation of the destabilization, right? In terms of history, and so another I think really crucial point that we were circling around with was thinking about began with the ideas like the historical spaces and the museum and the care of the object, but then also thinking about how time is conceived within a museum context, right? And this brings in like both we saw in terms of the opacity and trying to live in that space of stabilization, and then bringing in Hito Staro, where she talks this space, like the image, like so she writes about. I mean, think about this image, where she describes a military tank in the museum space. Um, Differently than an actual like active tank itself. And so the question of whether like museums or cultural institutions, the idea of the past can only exist if there is a present. I mean, a future actually, like a present, but even more future. That in some sense, one cannot move on if history. I don't want to say that there's a closed chapter, because in her writing she actually begins to talk about ways in which that relationship has to be called into question, where basically history and the future, they are not static, and it's not cyclical. It's the idea of in terms of the museum, we're all trying to actually destabilize and not. History is not a thing of the past. Actually, like history is actually a conversation with the future. So that was something I wanted to talk to you about, like having worked in these institutions too, and thinking about role of objects in that space, but how I guess both of us as working in those realms, like how do we think about historical time in that way? I mean, that's a vague question, but yeah, I think both of us were contemplating that image that Cheryl had talked of when history is, how do we move on from history? How do we conceive of history now in future tense?
Yeah, I think she uses a very powerful word. She says that you can't let the past take the present as hostage. And I find that really compelling, because the past should be, is a burden that we all have to shoulder together collectively. But same thing with the future. It's a space that we all have to collectively make, right? And the museum space is one that envisions a time now. It has to be, of course, relevant to what is happening now, but it also has to, I think, envision the space that we want. It always has to be a space of ideal. The ideal is to come. It's not right now, and I think that is an enormously difficult project, and you really begin from some very foundational questions, just basic questions of how do we see and how do we know. So again, I think the thing that artists do well, maybe in some ways better than historians, is it calls into question what it is that we are seeing and why and how. And a project like yours is very much sort of, I think, empowering of the viewer. Really question what the heck is it that you are seeing, right? And what is the importance of this, right? It's funny that the object itself is considered unimportant, and that I think is really beautiful, because, well, why, right? And so, what is the significance of this object for the future generation? Maybe nothing, except for the fact that how it is that we learn and see and perceive things.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing I've been thinking about more, is how can we look at history not as something that is closed, because of the past is, there's that connecting point where, I'm also fascinated too with how you define the past, right? There's the past in terms of history age, right? In terms of there's a long enough time that has passed, but also, a second has gone by, and that's already history, recent history. So, thinking about how those images exist within that space. I mean, that's the thing I'm also interested too with and things that are, that I've been lucky enough to be able to see, or at least know exist, is there also, the artifact is also such a conundrum in terms of time, because it's from the past, but but it's here, right? Like it's actually here, and so in a way, it's when you think about how we talk about things, it's interesting because it's in our present, if that makes sense. Because it'd be different, I think, if this artifact and the artifacts we look at like no longer existed, right? So, it's moments like this, like, having this conversation that make me think about another interesting contradiction of, well, not contradiction, but a complexity of a thing that has such a huge trajectory in its existence. It's historical, but it's actually still here. Yeah, and so then, that sort of makes us think about the present and the
Yeah, it's witness to
yeah, I don't know if that makes
history, and we have to honor
hmm
that, right? Like
hmm
and in order to honor that, like we have to make space for it in the future.
right.
And that's what
Yeah,
exhibitions do. That's what museums do, hopefully.
right. Yeah, yeah. And I feel bad because I think, but before we were, when we were uh, temporarily vaporized, or when Instagram had cut, there was a question. I don't know if I didn't catch that comment, but I think we've lost a lot of people. But I'm just wondering if people who are joining um, have questions, but I think we've lost it. I'm just grabbing a piece of paper here. Have anything? I know this is not the best setup, and I'm like peering at the screen. But I don't know, Liz, if you caught any of the questions that came up in the conversation.
I
I think they're
was
mostly like
I only
waves.
read half
Yeah.
of it. Yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
think the last one that was right before, yeah, the Instagram. It, I think it was like a comment and a question, but I didn't catch it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know if they came back, but I don't know. Yeah. If there's
Well,
anything else,
opacity.
like, oh yeah, was it about opacity?
No, no, I'm just making a joke. That
Yeah. No,
the
yeah. No.
question will remain unknown.
Right.
The question has a
Yeah.
right to opacity.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's in a way like this whole platform is calling into question a lot of things. Um, is there anything else? In a way, I don't want to drag out something or ruin a good, overdo a good thing. But in a way, I think we're making up for lost time because it's been such a long time since we've had a chance to really reconnect. Um,
It has
and
been
then
a
if
long
anything,
time,
just
and
helps.
just yeah. Yeah, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying this is an interesting continuation of your practice, Gwenessa, because the two things that I'm thinking about as I was rereading the text that I wrote like 6 years ago about your work, actually two separate
Mhm.
texts, things that came up
Right.
constantly
Yeah.
were history and
Mm.
perception. And so these are, this is another way for you to explore these topics, which I really find fascinating in the context of sort of museum at a crossroads today and the development of that institution of knowledge and display. So thank you for bringing the project to my attention and to share this conversation with everybody.
Yeah, no, and grateful that you're as well, but also, yeah, I mean, I'm hoping we can continue this in some way now that we've reconnected and Instagram seems to be cooperating with us in this way. But also, you've been all. I just also wanted to share with our. You also have a reading, right? With you've been also having.
Oh yeah, I do.
What? Yeah, do you want to share that with
I
it's
should,
through
yeah,
the
I should
university?
actually, yeah. I should plug my role as the curator at UB Art Galleries. So,
Hmm.
ubartgalleries.org. And we've
Hmm.
been collaborating with a photo organization to run a virtual reading. So, actually, the next next one is coming up October, what is it, next Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. And our topic is listening to photographs, which
okay. So maybe
very relevant to like our discussion, like
yeah,
particulate objects.
yeah.
What can you hear when you actually pay attention to an image? So I hope people can UB Art Galleries.
Maybe that's
.org.
the next platform we'll connect. Maybe that's the next way we'll connect, and maybe people here can join us there. And are the readings online?
The readings are online. So if you go to our website and click on event, that's you will find out the details of our next reading group on Wednesday.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. No, now I'm seeing the comments. Oh, thank you, Ingrid. Thanks, Lu Chan. So I don't know if you have a question for Liz and I, because we're both up. But since we have 5 of you, so, maybe we'll just give a second. If anyone has a question before we end. No? But okay. Well, if not, so maybe I'm not teaching Wednesday, so maybe we'll try to reconnect. It's on Zoom
Yeah, it's on Zoom. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we can all regather there, because I feel like there's we need to keep the conversation going. Yeah. All right.
Sounds
okay.
Good.
Well,
right.
Now without the timer, I got to figure out how to end this, but
nice
so I
to
guess
see you,
so have a good
Gwenessa.
afternoon. I really appreciate this, and let's reconnect next week then. Okay.
All right. Sounds good. Bye.